Hi folks. The topic of this video lecture is stereography. And when I was a kid in the 1950s, my dad came home very excited with a brand new type of record player. And he said, you're not going to believe your ears, but this will sound like you are right there at the scene where things are being recorded. And of course what we're talking about was the first stereo sound system that consumers could buy. This was 1950, this was not 1850, wasn't alive then. But in the 1950s, the recording companies had figured out how to have two different microphones and making two different tracks on one record, and then being able to figure out how to get a tone arm and a needle on the turntable to pick that signal back up and pipe the two different soundtracks to the two different speakers, which were on different corners of the room. And of course, when you bought one of these things, you wanted to be on the first person on your block to have a stereo sound system. And you bought a demonstration record. And as a kid, I remember listening to the sounds of a steam engine. And for all of the world, if I closed my eyes, I would say the steam engine was over here, and then you would hear it going chug, 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 and it felt like to your ears it was moving chug, 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 and then it would go on faster and faster and chug, 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 and then it would go over to this speaker over here. And I mean, we could have charged everybody in the neighborhood 25 cents admission. That was a big deal. That was 100 years after people who were experimenting in photography came up with something called stereography. And in stereography, this was right after the early experiments. The age of stereography was 1850 to 1920. And let's see whether my whiteboard will be working today. 1850 to 1920. Now when we say the age of stereography, what we mean by that is that it was an illusion. It was an optical illusion that was created with the use of a special kind of a camera. And you'll notice here that the camera has two different lenses to it, and it has some rigging which is invisible, but a camera has a lens and it has a shutter which opens and closes to take the picture, and it has a film chamber in the back where the film is. Now imagine that you put two cameras on top of each other and you have a link between the shutters so that you, when you're taking the top picture, you're also taking the bottom picture. What is interesting about this arrangement is that these two lenses are about 3 inches apart. And if you go into the mirror and you take a ruler and you measure from pupil to pupil, you're going to find out that your biology has given you two cameras, your eyeballs, and they have put them at about 3 inches apart. So when the picture is developed, it's almost like you're seeing double. I'm just going to show you this side right here. This is a picture that was taken in Japan in the very late 1800s or the very early 1900s. Japan had been off limits to the world until 1850, when we forcibly made them re-enter the world of trade. There was a lot of curiosity about what places far away from home looked like. And so this new type of commercial photography, which is called stereography, or we nickname it armchair travel, was created. Now, photographers had been cashing in on taking pictures of people. But now, photographers started to travel all around the world and take pictures of different places and come home, and they would have factories that would take the negatives and reprint them and over, and they would mount them on a piece of curved cardboard like this, and they would print information on the back of it so that you could read all about what you saw on this side. It was an educational form of entertainment, and people loved this. Between 1850 and 1920. Maybe, if you've been to an antique shop, you have seen a stereo viewer, okay? This is a stereo viewer. It has a couple of little lenses in it, and then it has a card holder. This is called a stereograph. This is called a stereoscope, and the whole thing together is called stereography. So if I insert this card in the holder, and then I look through here, and I move the card forward and backwards a little bit at a time, I will finally find a spot where the two images merge into one image. And it's magical, because when the two images melt together, your eye is convinced that you are looking at a three-dimensional scene. If I take my ruler and I measure each one of these pictures, there's two of them, they come out to be about 3 inches square each. When I look through the viewer, I am not aware of anything as far as a boundary to the picture. It's like virtual reality. This is the original virtual reality hood. And when I look through here, the picture looks much, much, much bigger than what it would if I just looked at it like this without the viewer. So Sunday was the day of rest. It was when the farmers did not have to work. It was when the townspeople closed up their dry goods stores. Everybody went to church in the morning, and then you had Sunday dinner, and afterwards people would get together for coffee and cake, and they did not watch TV. There was no such thing as TV. They did not look at magazines because there were no pictures in magazines. It was all reading material. So between 1850 and 1920, people would buy sets of cards like this. And they would buy them from places like Sears Roebuck. And they'd have a catalog from Sears, and Sears would be advertising, "We just got a new set of stereo cards from, well, Yosemite." And people had heard of Yosemite Valley, but they hadn't seen it. They had heard about it, but it was way, way, way out west. And only explorers would go out there. Well, some of the explorers that went out there took stereo cameras with them. And they would take these And you'd see somebody in church that morning and they'd say, okay, I'll be over at 2 o'clock and I'm going to bring my set of stereo cards from Yosemite. And that would be the life of the party. You'd have cake and you'd have coffee and you'd have conversation, and this would be passed around from one person to the next person to the next person, and everybody would take a turn adjusting it and making the two images come together, and all of a sudden they felt like they were standing on a rock way, way, way high up above the Merced River in Yosemite Valley. So remember this, forms of entertainment. 1850 to 1900, there were no movies, there were no motion pictures, okay? People played cards in certain parts of the country. In other parts of the country, card playing was outlawed. Invariably, you would find a piano in somebody's family room or living room, and when people got together, somebody was a pianist and the other people would gather around and they would sing some of the latest sheet music that was being bought. People read for entertainment. People, in some places, they danced. They would have a hoedown, or they would have some sort of music. Somebody would play a violin or something like that. But as far as visual entertainment was concerned, when this became popular in 1850, it dominated the entertainment cycle for about 50 years. Now, a little bit into the 1900s, we started to have movie houses open up, and before long, in the 1910s, we had more theater types of things, and people could go to the movies. But in 1920, photo magazines started to come out, and photo magazines kind of killed off this thing. People would come home and they'd look in their mailbox and they would see Life magazine, or they would see Saturday Evening Post or something that had pictures in it. And then it wasn't so special to look at these. The other thing that killed off stereography for sure in the 1950s, this is when television started to be broadcast to families all around the country, and then there was no chance. This was just something you found at grandma's or grandpa's house. This sort of thing here, and you might say, oh, what's that, Grandpa? And they would pull it out and they would show you this three-dimensional thing. I forgot to mention, I'll bet you that most every one of you as a child had a plastic viewer that was called a Viewmaster. And you put a circular set of pictures into it, you slid that down into it, and then you put that up to your eyes and you looked at the light and you saw 3D pictures, and they might have been cartoon pictures of Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck, or they might have been pictures of the Grand Canyon, or they might have been pictures of the Statue of Liberty. And those were called Viewmasters, and that is the grandchild of this. Okay, this was invented in the 1830s and developed to become a worldwide, not just the countrywide, but a worldwide thing. And they had books that had the viewer kind of built into the cover, and you would pop open the book and then you would click down and you would see frame after frame after frame of stereographs. These days, when you show up at the airport, you saw a touch screen and you're saying, well, what is there to do in this town? And you touch on a certain part of the map and it says the Phoenix Zoo, you should go to the Phoenix Zoo. And you open up another button and it says Taliesin West, and you look someplace else and it says the baseball park. And that happened. There was a viewer, there was actually a large freestanding 3D viewer in the lobby of hotels in those days. So if I went to New York in 1910, 1920, and I was just coming into New York, I would go to the hotel and check in, and I would say to the clerk, well, what is there to see around here? And they would point and they would say, well, go look at the stereoscopes in the lobby. And you'd go over, it looked like a big wooden box with two little peepholes in it, and they had an electric light inside of it, and then you would turn on levers or rotors on the sides, and slide after slide after slide after slide would show up in 3 dimensions. So it's very much like what we call an information kiosk today, but in those days that was actually in 3D. I want to show you a few other things. After the Civil War, which is after the 1860s, there was a big movement to go west. And sometimes the moms and the dads did not go west. They stayed on the East Coast, and they were farmers and they couldn't leave their holdings. But their sons and their daughters took advantage of homesteading, and they moved to the west. And people on the East Coast were really interested in what was happening out in the west. This is sometimes called expeditionary photography, when people with cameras go out far ahead of towns and cities. And this is on the Columbia River, and this is what the lumberjacks had been sawing down lumber and putting them together into these huge floating barges. It was just built out of trees after tree after tree after tree, all old growth original timber, which is an amazing thing. And then they would be floated down the river to the sawmill. So people back east were very interested, and they'd find out that their kid settled in some little logging town, and what was it that they were doing? They could see what they were doing. Foreign travel. This picture is taken of the Tsar's summer palace. When I say the Tsar, I mean the King of Russia. And there hasn't been a King of Russia since 1915. So this was taken before 1915. And if you were able to take a peek at this through a stereograph, these numbers of fountains would just be very three-dimensional. You would get a huge feeling of space and openness in this type of a picture. Folks did not go to Europe. That was really a tough trip. You had to get on a steamship, and you had to kind of be a gutsy traveler to go to Europe. And Russia was, of course, a little bit of an exotic destination. One thing that people were very interested in was the Holy Lands. And this is a picture of Easter being celebrated in Jerusalem. And when I look through the stereograph, I feel like I'm mixing and mingling with all of these people who are dressed up in their religious regalia, with their special head coverings and their special vestments. It's just a terrific way of stepping back in time 100 years. Now, when I look on the side of these cards, more times than not, I'll see something that says Keystone View Company. Keystone was one of the manufacturers that bought negatives from these traveling photographers. I can look on this card and I will not find a photographer's name, but I will find the company name. So photographers were working anonymously. They would have an assignment. They would maybe say to Keystone, "What do you need?" And they would say, "Well, I need pictures of Jerusalem at Easter." And so somebody would take off a couple months early, and they would travel over to the Holy Lands, and they'd be there for Easter, and they'd celebrate, set up their cameras and catch the celebration, and then come back to New York. Let's see, it says New York, London, Sydney, Australia. So they would have these manufacturing plants. And again, I talked to you about women in the workforce as portrait people. So now we had women working in attention to detail, very important attention to detail, printing these pictures, gluing these pictures onto boards, running printing presses. This one doesn't have facts on the back of it, but a lot of times they would run a printing press and get picture information on the back. So there were all different kinds of genres of stereo cards, and some people today are collectors. I am a very casual collector. I'm not serious about it. If I see an antique store, I'll walk in and I'll just ask, and I'll say, "Do you have a box of stereo cards?" And these days might be 50-50. If you go into Brass Armadillo, you will see in certain cases you're going to see stereo cards, okay? So there are different genres. There's travel ones, there's educational ones, there's ones that celebrate homesteading, there's ones that celebrate industry. This is just a girly picture. And you may not think of it much as a girly picture, but remember that this is the Victorian era, and she is showing way too much skin for a proper family. So I'm not so sure that this one was actually shown at the Sunday get-together, but there was a market for the girly picture type of thing. Humor. Okay, are you ready for a real knee slapper? Here is the picture. It is 4 women and a mule, okay? Now, here's the cut line on it. It says 4 queens and a jack. You're supposed to laugh now, okay? 19th century, early 20th century humor. 4 queens and a jack. People were celebrating industry. This is kind of the coming of age of the Industrial Revolution. So they wanted to brag about places where they were working. They wanted to brag about the fact that they had mechanized. There were a lot of things to be said about certain areas in the country that were doing industry right rather than doing industry wrong. So people would visit these factories and they would take pictures of them, and other people would be able to look at these pictures again, a feeling of three-dimensional space, and they would feel like they'd actually toured the plant. War correspondents. These photographers literally got onto the battlefield of the Great War. World War I is what we would say, but in their day they said the Great War. And during the Great War, aircraft were being used for the first time. And this is the remains of a German Zeppelin. That's a huge, if you see the Goodyear blimp floating around over a football game, imagine 2, 3, maybe 3 of those all kind of fused together into a big long cigar-shaped balloon that has engines on it. And that's called, this was like the Hindenburg, a Zeppelin. The fault of the military designers is that the Zeppelin was filled with a flammable gas, hydrogen. And when it was floating around over the battlefield, doing reconnaissance work, looking down, or maybe even dropping a few bombs down on the enemy, it was also a pretty good target for some of the French and some of the British and some of the Yankees, some of the American troops. And every once in a while, someone would score a direct hit, and one of these huge blimps would come down. And when they crashed, they burned, and you'll see the metal remains here of the superstructure of the Zeppelin. And all of these people in the foreground are doing inspections and checking out the technology of that. So news reporting, if somebody was running for office, you would see pictures of them doing a stump speech. Natural disasters, if there was a flood in the Tennessee Valley, you would see pictures of the flood. All sorts of things became eligible for stereography. So that's kind of a little bit about armchair travel. And the assignment's going to spell out a few more things for you, but I thought that I should show you what a stereoscope looks like and also promote you. I'd like to get you curious, and when we're able to go out of the house without worrying about things, I'd like you to go to an antique store. There are some in downtown Glendale. Over here in Goodyear, there's the brass armadillo, and I'd like you to wander around and look for stereoscopes and stereographs and ask the people and say, hey, I'm interested in this. I paid $100 for my stereoscope. I bought another one online, not quite as old, and I think I paid $25 or $35 for that. You can buy them online, and you can get a set of cards for a few dollars, or if you're a collector, and it's kind of like baseball cards, there are certain kinds of stereo slides that are worth hundreds and thousands of dollars because they're so rare. But usually I'm paying somewhere around $2 to $5, maybe $10 for a stereo card from an antique store. So I hope I've been able to get you curious about something that happened and happened in a big way, and then it kind of disappeared because of photo magazines, motion pictures, and eventually television. Nowadays, every once in a while, you'll see a wedding photographer who advertises that they will deliver stereo slides. Oh, if you want to take your own stereo picture, there's no real big trick to it as long as the subject is not moving. So if I'm in a parking lot someplace and I want to take a picture of all the cars that are going down a row, I'll take out my camera and I will take my first picture. I'll put my feet together This is normally a stance that you don't do, but you put your feet together and you hold your camera exactly steady. Tuck your elbows into your sides and take the first picture and call it the left picture. Always do like you're reading. Take the first picture, click, and say, okay, that's my left picture. Now, you can't see it, but I'm going to move my right foot 6 inches away from my left foot. And now I'm going to put my feet back together again. I have moved 6 inches. The camera has moved 6 inches, and I will take the second picture of the same thing. Click. And now I have the right picture. So if I know my Photoshop, I can run home, download the 2 pictures, and I can crop it 3 inches square. That's the left picture. Print it and crop it 3 inches square and glue it onto a piece of cardboard that will fit into my viewer. And then I can download the right picture and crop it to 3 inches square, and I can glue that down. And then I can get my stereo viewer and put it into my stereo viewer, and I have made my own stereo slides. I don't have one of them right here, but in my collection I have some homemade stereo slides that feature just a plain ordinary living room in a house, and it looks an awful lot like my grandparents' house as they had their house set up in the 1940s. So stereos were also done by folks that know something about photography, and in the 1930s and the 1940s, many people had a little darkroom stuck down in the corner of the basement, and they bought their photo supplies at the drugstore. They bought little packets that were already measured out of developer and stop bath and fixer, and they would go home and they would make either contact prints from their negatives, or some of them even had enlargers, and they could make enlargements, and they could make their own 3x3 pictures and glue them down and make their own stereographs. So definitely most of them were purchased. They were taken by anonymous people. The Keystone Company was just one of them that got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Very successful until 1920, and then it went downhill. All right, I hope that helps you. Bye-bye.